guys, and welcome to another video. And in this video I will be explaining you why the Entropy Zero series, which is a modification for Half-Life 2, or rather a series of modifications for Half-Life 2, which are fan-made, should be in fact considered canon for the Half-Life 2 lore. Now, this is something that a lot of people are going to disagree with, and something that could spark a lot of controversies. However, I feel like a lot of people that say that they shouldn't be canon do not really have any valid arguments as to why they shouldn't be considered canon, and it mostly comes down to just corporate gatekeeping of the Half-Life 2 lore. So the first entry in the Entropy Zero series was of course Entropy 01. Now, the reason why I consider Entropy 01 canon is because it takes place in a completely different part of the world during the Combine occupation than Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 takes place in City 17 and outside of City 17, like the Wastelands, Outlands, Noah Prospect, which is the route that Gordon Freeman takes. However, Entropy 02 takes place in City 10. Now, City 17 is in Bulgaria, in the capital of Sofia, if I'm not mistaken. However, City 10 is located in Russia, in St. Petersburg, meaning the protagonist of Entropy Zero, which is Unit 3650, also known as Bad Cop, also known as Aiden Walker, has absolutely nothing to do with what Gordon Freeman does in Half-Life 2 in City 17 and outside of City 17, because Bad Cop is stranded in City 10, thousands of kilometers away from City 17. Therefore, there's absolutely no way for Bad Cop to ever really venture into City 17 and possibly into the places where Gordon Freeman went. Therefore, there is no lore or time or logic paradox, because the two protagonists' stories do not intersect at all during this time. As I said, Entropy 01 takes place in City 17. Sorry, not City 17, City 10. It takes place in City 10, which is thousands of kilometers away from the main Combine settlement, which is City 17. Also, City 10 is completely overrun by the sea flu pandemic and has been completely overtaken by rebels. Next, I want to focus on Entropy 02, which also most people do not consider canon, but I do, and for a set of very good reasons. First of all, Entropy 02 takes place, once again, for the most part, in a completely different part of the world. It takes place in the Arctic. Most notably, it takes place in the several orbit communication facilities, which is actually a cover company for Aperture Science, as we discover in the game. And this is once again a place where Gordon Freeman never went during his story in Half-Life 2. Meaning, once again, no lore paradoxes are being created. And Bad Cop, now an elite soldier tasked with hunting down Judith Mossman, which has betrayed the Combine, therefore that's why he's hunting her down, because she holds valuable resistance information. She's a scientist. The whole story of the game has almost nothing to do with City 17. Yes, the game starts in City 17. You know, the part where you are like in the civil protection base, then you are sent on crab duty, clearing the events from head crabs because you got late to work. And then you overhear your fellow CP officers planning to sabotage your work because they don't like bad cop. That canonically takes place before the events of Entropy 01. Because bad cop during that time is still a metro cop. So he kills them and then gets obviously punished for it. For killing his fellow metro cops, and he is sent on Outlands duty. When he finishes his duty in the Outlands, he is returning back to City 17, but the razor train that was transporting him and the other metro cops that were with him gets sabotaged by rebels while it's passing through City 10. As I said, City 10 was completely overrun by rebels. And he gets stuck in City 10 and has to escape. Therefore, he never reaches City 17 in the first game. And then it also takes place at the Borealis during the later half of the game, or pretty much during the end of the game, but you know, that's also where Gordon Freeman never really went himself, especially not the location where Borealis was located at the end of Entropy 02. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, well, what about the weapons? Because the weapons should be a dead giveaway that the games are not lore accurate or not canon. But this is also not a good argument, because the weapons that Bad Cop uses are basically either experimental or deserviced weapons from the Combine's arsenal that are no longer used by the time of Half-Life 2, and he just found them by basically accident. Now Entropy 02 takes place during like episode 1, I believe. And I mean, the only reason why Bad Cop found his weapons is because he just found them kind of by accident, or was, yeah, just kind of found them, you know. Because his Combine unit, so he had access to facilities that had these weapons. For example, the Ghost Pistol is an experimental Combine weapon. But it's experimentally, it was never mass issued like the 9mm USP match. You have the MP5K, which in the lore of Entropy 02 is considered a deserviced old Combine like SMG, or deserviced SMG that was used by the Combine in the past, but was eventually phased out in favor of the MP7. But it was used during the earlier days of the invasion. I mean, Bad Cop himself says that he hasn't seen one of these in a long time. So this suggests that the Combine originally did use this SMG and just phased it out later on, decommissioned it. And then you have the prototype pulse rifle, which once again is a prototype and a early iteration of the pulse rifle, but it's also deserviced because it's a prototype. Therefore, resistance members do not have access to it because they get the pulse rifles by looting Overwatch units they killed. And standard Overwatch units, like the Overwatch transhuman arm units in Half-Life 2, do not carry this pulse rifle. This was perhaps being used by the time when Batko was in City 10. I'm not exactly sure, because in City 10 he has this rifle as well. But that doesn't really change the fact that this is a prototype that is no longer used. And the Aperture Science Zen relay grenades, well, these were only accessible in the secret underground Aperture Science laboratories. And Gordon Freeman never went into Aperture Science. However, Aiden Walker, Unit 3650, did go there, meaning he had a chance to find these grenades. So the weapons, once again, do not really create any sort of paradox. They're just either experimental or just leftover weapons from the early days of Invasion that Aiden Walker managed to salvage. And then the next game I want to talk about, and the last game, is Entropy Zero Uprising. Now, Entropy Zero Uprising is basically a mod for a mod. It's a modification for Entropy Zero 1, which itself is a modification for Half-Life 2. However, I don't really think there's any valid reason to not consider it canon, because even though Entropy Zero Uprising does take place in City 17, it takes place in a completely different port of City 17. The main protagonist, which I believe is called Victor 60, a civil protection officer, along with 2810, or sorry, I'm not really, or Beck, his name is Beck, I believe, like his companion. They're in a completely different sector of City 17, because City 17 is huge. It's the main settlement of the Combine on Earth. Is the main center of operations of the Combine and the main urban settlement. Therefore it's very big, and it simply takes place in parts of the city that during the uprising that Gordon Freeman never visited. So I don't really think there is any valid argument to not consider Entropy Zero Uprising canon either. Yes, there are weapons like the MP5K, but once again, the protagonist is just using old, deserviced weapons, and we talked about that already. So the main premise of this video is that none of the 3 Entropy Zero games we discussed here create any sort of logic or timeline paradox, and they are very well integrated into the Half-Life 2 lore. They are very high effort pieces of gaming, and to be honest, even Mark Laidlaw himself stated that there is no official Half-Life canon. That, well, I mean, obviously there is like a baseline you have to follow, like the Black Mesa incident and the Combine invasion, but it's not like a rigid corporate product that the Half-Life 2 lore gatekeepers like to imagine it as. Valve themselves do encourage the community to interact and expand upon the lore. and they refuse the stance of a approach that only Valve-made stuff is lore accurate. Once again, Molecular Law himself said that this is not the case, that they want the community to actively interact and expand upon the base lore which was made by Valve. And since both Aiden Walker and Victor 60 do not intersect Gordon Freeman's paths, or when they do, like for example in Nova Prospect, that is already after Gordon Freeman was there, because in Entropy 02, Nova Prospect is already in ruins. After the Antlion fight, you can even see the dead Antlion guard. So this shows that Aiden Walker was there already after Gordon Freeman left. And so with this said, I don't really think there are any other arguments that could be used against the Entropy Zero series for them not being lore accurate. I mean, you have to look at the Half-Life lore and how the Combine functions through a lens of realism, right? Through a lens of how real-life militaries work, how real-life logistics work, and when you look at them realistically and the lore this way, it will help you understand why some things are the way they are. For example, why Bad Cop is using deserviced weapons in the game, and so forth. And Judith Mossman does get indeed captured during the events of Entropy 02. Which I think also makes sense since you do not really hear from her ever again in Half-Life 2.